Hey there guys, it's Metro, and today we're back continuing the series of frequently asked questions from the stream. This one's a pretty popular one. What's your favorite expansion? And then I bring up it's Mists of Pandaria, and people get all kind of confused and upset. So we're going to go down systematically through everything that is objectively good about Mists of Pandaria, and some of the things that are also my favorite about it. Just like the Wrath video, we're not going to include any video at all, so to not detract from the facts that I'm presenting or things that I see as facts. And we'll also just probably be reading off a script for about 90% of it because I want to make sure the information is disseminated properly and there's no all that, nonsense. So let's get right into it. So Mists of Pandaria is a polarizing expansion to say the least, for many reasons, most of which revolve around the theme and not the actual developed content within the expansion. And most people who argue that it is not a good expansion almost never give credit to the massive system and content pathway development time that came along with the expansion. I feel there is no debate in saying that Mists of Pandaria is objectively the most expansive, quote unquote, of the expansions, in that it added the most content to have a lasting impact and an immediate use to the video game. I should also note that we're not including Legion in this discussion, as the expansion is not even halfway over yet, but it will likely take the crown from Mists of Pandaria unless some massive disaster occurs in the last two major patches. The thing about MoP is that the raids and patch cycles were also the most verbose of any expansion, and should be another obvious reason for this discussion. We'll call this point 0. We had 3 raid tiers and sizable patches in between, including 11-week lore progression and zone-changing dailies in 5.1, known as the Dominus Offensive, and then the crazy changes to the Barrens in Battlefield Barrens in patch 5.3, on top of 3 major tiers: Siege of Orgrimmar, Throne of Thunder, and the first tier, which 3 raids in it. Even though the patch cycles of MoP seem to be way more in line with what they're trying to do now with Legion, I don't want to count raids into this discussion because every expansion always has amazing raids, but it should be noted that the actual content they delivered in MoP along the timeline that they delivered it was also the most verbose of any expansion. So I'm claiming that Mists of Pandaria features the most content pathway and system changes of any expansion. In order to do that successfully, I'm going to need to list all of the things that do change, and hopefully that will be enough to suffice. We'll start with number 1, and my favorite addition in Mists of Pandaria: challenge mode difficulty of dungeons. They added a difficulty of dungeon that allowed for renewable challenge and intense community competition for the first time ever. Yes, I said ever. There were difficult dungeons in the Burning Crusade and even at the start of Cataclysm, but there was never a dungeon that was tuned to be difficult no matter what your progression was. For example, in the Burning Crusade, the difficulty of the dungeons was immense early, but eventually, it changed some, they nerfed them, but you also got a lot of gear. By the time you're in Hyjal gear, and even, T6, of course, got even worse, the dungeons simply were no longer challenging and turned just into AoE fests. Same thing with Cataclysm and basically any other expansion. Mists of Pandaria absolutely was the first to have dungeons that were tuned to be difficult no matter when you were doing them. And of course, if you played Legion, the challenge mode concept that came through Mist and WoD was of course the predecessor of the hugely successful Mythic plus dungeon concept. Number 2 on this list is world content revolving around the Timeless Isle especially. I'm not foolish enough to try to say that dailies were good content in MoP or even that they were expansive content. Dailies had been in previous expansions before, and if anything, they were vastly overdone in MoP. It was really just 1 or 2 storylines repeated for multiple weeks until you finally finished what you're after. Not a big fan of that, but what I was a big fan of was the Timeless Isle style content that did get added in MoP, and I feel is one of the most expansive changes the expansion creates. By the end, we received one of the most unique and progressive world content ideas ever since TBC. The Timeless Isle became a hub of active PvP, PvE, exploration, and acted as a perfect answer to catch-up gear with extra reward options. This was the start of what became the world quest in Legion, and I feel like that is another system that has absolutely a massive impact in Legacy. Number 3 on this list is one of the highest impact things that was brought with the expansion, and that is flexible raid size. In patch 5.4, they added flex difficulty, which we now know as normal difficulty, and which tech is used in heroic still to this day. It, in my opinion, is a perfect example of ways to make raiding easier but not invalidate the social dedication that is needed in a progression raid mindset. It should be a 1-to-1 replacement for LFR, but we have not gotten that far yet. Regardless, it is easy to say it is one of the biggest changes the game has ever seen, and has been a boon for anyone looking to raid, but not to worry about how many players are strictly needed. Especially if you played Classic, you understand that having 40 at all times is not always easy, especially on a server with a lot of European and and United States populations. Sometimes it's difficult to find that quality extra player and would be simply easier to do it with 35. Along with the size changes, flexible difficulty introduced for the first time a loot lockout. Instead of just an instance ID like lockout where we have with Mythic and back in Classic, etc. This allowed players to run the same raid dozens of times if they wanted, but made them ineligible for loot entirely after the first time. This also coincides with the personal loot system that was added as well, and all in all summarizes one of the biggest changes that Mists of Pandaria created. Another big one comes in at number 4, and that is the Connected Realm, aka Coalesced Realm feature that got brought towards the end of MoP. They began combining realms that were struggling to keep an even faction balance and have enough players for progression rating towards the end of MoP. At the time, there were realms that still had the Realm First Arthas achievement available due to extremely low population and activity. And if it continued on this path, these realms would be incredibly damaging to the stability of the video game overall. Blizzard connected realms with similar sizes in order to create larger active realms with no detraction whatsoever or damage to any character name or identity. This was a big problem for a lot of people. When they announced it, they said, what's going to happen to our name? Who's going to be allowed to collect the names? So what they ended up doing was just adding like a moniker at the end of it. So I'm Metro LOL Firetree, and if there's another Metro LOL on Spirestone, he can have that name as well. Many people cite this as the end of realm identity, however, but unfortunately it was a mandatory fix for an aging video game's dwindling population. No matter what you want to say about WoW, every year less and less active people play it. New expansions bring new players all the time, but it's not enough to revitalize realms that have less than 2 raiding guilds on them. In fact, even now with the connected realms, there are realms that are just completely useless, have almost no players playing on them actively, and it may even be time for another set of connections coming up in the future here. So that's what I'm considering tier 1 on this list. Those are 4 or 5 depending major changes to the video game that I think stand up with some of the biggest changes of all time, and a few of them happen within a few months of each other. So if anybody has anything to contest, it would be those points for sure. The next set of things are things that you kind of expect with regular expansion cycles, but still they are added, so we will discuss them. First thing on that list, number 5 here total, is scenario, tech, and difficulty, quote unquote difficulty. For those who hadn't played Mists of Pandaria, they toyed with the idea of having a type of group content that did not require a tank or healer, where most of the mechanics within were simply something you could deal with always as a player, either always avoid, always interrupt, always stun, and were mostly featuring key lore and activities related to the setting. Eventually, they even went on to make heroic scenarios, but the idea was wholly scrapped in Warlords of Draenor. However, the tech that was used to create the scenario went on to be the foundation for things like Holn High Mountain quests in Legion and etc. It's an overlooked thing. I think a lot of people look back at MoP and say, what scenarios? Because they were pretty much irrelevant even at the end when the heroic scenarios were the best way to obtain valor for upgrading gear. They almost had no relevance throughout, and it really felt like kind of just like a fun thing to do. So it's no surprise they scrapped them, but regardless, the tech that was there was incredibly important for moving forward. Number 6 is a new class and race being added. For the first time in any expansion, it added both a new class and a new race at the same time. The monk was a balanced nightmare for tier 2 and still struggles with its identity, but brings a unique element to the tanking and healing meta in World of Warcraft. The Pandaren race is one that is heavily scrutinized, but also brings a rich element to an already diverse high fantasy universe. Many people do not like the Asian theme that both of these brought, but objectively, you cannot deny that a new class and race are a healthy thing to boast for any expansion. Number 7 is the new talent system that was introduced. Much to the chagrin of vanilla veterans and purists, Mists of Pandaria featured the removal of the 10 to 85 legacy-style talent point system and converted to one much more focused on actual choices at max level. Many of the talents were poorly balanced at first, but the goal, as we have realized in Legion, is to have a set of 3 choices that are usable in many different situations, so as to not allow for cookie-cutter combinations like we saw in Classic through Wrath of the Lich King. The system is undoubtedly worse for leveling, no questions there, but by this point, leveling was truly not focused on at all, and is much more suitable to a 13-year-old competitive landscape. Imagine having 100 talent points to spend at level 110 right now, and you'll understand why this system is simply the way they had to move, and much better for the endgame balance overall. Number 8 is going to be combining 2 topics, Proving Grounds and Brawlers Guild. More of a concept and a mindset than actual content. Both were added as a way to challenge and engage individuals without involving groups, and had the potential to be something parallel to the challenge of challenge mode dungeons, but were ultimately phased out over the years in favor of making them just for fun, quote-unquote, content and minorly challenging. Proving Grounds went on to be a mandatory part of the LFD, LFR type content in Warlords of Draenor, and Brawlers Guild is back with amazing, unique boss battles and content in Legion. So overall, I'd say the two had more of a representative of where they wanted to go with this solo type content, but still have a legacy to maintain in the future. So we'll call those for tier 2, things that are big additions to the expansion, but not much bigger than most expansions. And then we'll call these tier 3, somewhat smaller changes, but still things that went on to have a very lasting impact on the legacy of the video game. Number 9 is going to be the farm. This was the early progenitor of the class overhaul concept, but was directly responsible for the garrison, of which many players did not favor. The farm was content that was renewable and served as a way to acquire resources reliably without having a profession. The idea was not a healthy one overall, but the skeleton of the concept is one that has transcended in through 3 expansions. I like the theme and the idea behind the farm and the fact that there was, daily, basically weekly content to be had in there, but I certainly was not a big fan of how you can just get free materials from it without even having the professions required. Number 10, pet battles. A mocked addition by many, but undeniably a fun addition to the game, which does absolutely no harm whatsoever to the remainder of the content. Pet battles served as a fun time sink for those who loved exploration and collection, and does include some strategy and skill, especially when considering the Celestial Tournament that was added in patch 5.4, which to this day still has dozens, if not hundreds of guides on ways to complete optimally. Pet battles continue to be a sidelined form of content, but are simply something optional to do in the game that already features dozens of ways to advance your characters. A lot of people out there, especially in the classic community, cite this as a change that shows Blizzard lacked the same interest in the direction of the game that they did at one point, but I would point this towards something that they thought would be a fun addition and not actually detract from things, serious content like raiding or PvP. Number 11 is the Warlock Green Fire quest chain. Although not major content by any stretch of the imagination, the Green Fire questline, along with the Hunter Rare Tames, were step 1 back towards a return to class and spec specificity that we have fully explored with Legion once again along the artifact and class hall situations. I've never played a Warlock really before in my life at all, so I've never done the chain myself, but what I did see on YouTube videos and other media is that it was quite a challenge at the time. Even towards the end of the expansion, it was still a challenge, and still to this day requires you to think a little bit outside the box. I think it's a great example of what they can do with class stuff. They may not have hit the nail on the head in Legion since they wanted to make that all part of the leveling process, and they needed to make sure it was certainly not excluding anyone, but I definitely think that in the upcoming Legion patches we're going to see more content like this, challenging stuff per spec and class, and it all started with this concept and can be traced back to the early days of Classic when we had the Warlock and Paladin epic mount quests that involved a lot of individual work as well. I think that is something that any fan of World of Warcraft should abide by and should respect. That type of class and spec specificity is very healthy for the game and makes you feel like you're a Paladin or a Warlock. Finally, as number 12, I wanted to bring up the lesser charm of good fortune and of course what they built into as well. This is a concept that has changed greatly over the expansions, but has always encouraged players to play outside of raid in order to get a benefit inside of the raid. Now, we simply buy these bonus rolls with gold, but it still encourages players to run raids when they are already loot locked and helps players earn gear from a raid that they might not have any chance of receiving any from. This actually really harkens to something that I would love to see in Classic, some type of extra incentive to do content when there's absolutely no gear that you need, or when there's no chance that you'll get gear, like when you're in a pug and somebody has something on reserve. Not my favorite idea, and I definitely don't like it socially, but regardless, I think the lesser charm of good fortune concept that Mop added has a lasting legacy in the video game. So that's that. That's the answer to the question, why is Mop the best expansion and why is it your favorite? It's a long one, of course. There's a lot to get through, and I think that says a lot about the expansion, especially the tier 1 list, like the first 4 or 5 things I mentioned. They're all just massive changes that don't happen in any other expansion, except maybe Legion. And even the smaller stuff, like pet battles and proving grounds, stuff like that, they have a big impact on the game's future, and even during Mop as well. So maybe the best way to look at this is that maybe Mop isn't the de facto best expansion, but it certainly is one to be reckoned. And the amount of people who discredit it just because they don't like the theme, they say, oh, pandas, I don't like that, it doesn't fit. This is a high fantasy universe, guys. There's a lot of things that are very nonsensical and seem a little off, but the things that were added in MoP, in my opinion, perfectly fit with the theme of the video game overall. Going to Pandaria did feel a bit strange, but now that we're back and we have the monk and the Pandaren for good, I don't even remember that any of that stuff happened. So if you guys have anything that you want to bring up, one thing that I would like to see in terms of criticism is ways that these things stack up to, say, other expansions. I don't really count Classic as an expansion, but if anybody wanted to take the time to compare these system changes to things that were introduced in Classic, I think that would be a very healthy discussion. If not, we'll see you guys in the next video.